The war in Syria has dominated the news agenda since 2013. The headlines have been deeply depressing. Civil war, the rise of ISIS, gas attacks, barrel bombs, thousands of displaced men, women and children forced to find refuge wherever they can. Well, in this hour, we're going to meet Danny Makki. Now, he's a Syrian journalist with first-hand experience of what life is really like there in the country. In fact, he's just returned to the UK, having been in Damascus for the last 2 months. Well, it's rare, I guess, that we get to hear first-hand experience from someone who has been in Syria in recent months. And if there are questions that you would like me to ask Danny, things about Syria or the Syrian conflict that you'd like me to put to him, phone lines are open so you can get involved in this discussion. 08081 008800 is the telephone number. What would you like to know about what's happening in Syria? Danny joins us now. Good morning to you, Danny Makki.
Good morning.
Good morning. So did you grow up in Syria?
No, actually, I grew up in the United Kingdom. I was born here, and I've lived for about 24 years in London and the UK. I've only lived in Syria on and off for about 4 years before managing to, spend my time between Damascus and London for the last 2 years.
And what took you to Syria in the first place?
More than anything, it was just probably, this urge to actually be closer to Damascus and Syria, because I speak the language, because I've got a lot of contacts. It probably would have been easier for me to reach access and understand the way the country works more. And I've read and studied a lot about it, but nothing really prepared me for actually being in this war and going out with different news outlets. I mean, I worked as a fixer in Syria for quite a long time. I've worked with the BBC, I've worked with Channel 4, a lot of numerous outlets reporting from front lines or different areas within government-held Syria. And I guess the fact that I'm Syrian as well, that I speak Arabic, it's really helped me down this path. And in between all of this, I've tried to do stuff on my own, journalistically, articles, television interviews, and it's been a very, very, very busy few months and a few years, to be honest. It's nothing can prepare you for actually being in the country and seeing what happens, because what happens in Syria is probably different from any other country in the world. It's crazy, and being there for so long, you manage to pick up on a lot of small things which no one here would even possibly imagine.
I have never been to Syria, so my knowledge of the country is very limited, and it's limited only really to what I read and see in the news, most of which, of course, recently has been just disastrous. But from what I gather, Syria before the war was a pretty amazing country, a pretty lovely country with some beautiful architecture, some really inspirational people in Syria doing some really remarkable things.
Absolutely. I mean, it's only about 12, 13 years ago that Syria was deemed by the United Nations as the fourth safest country in the world, which is something, no other Arab or I think even Asian country managed to get that level of ranking. Tourism industry was flourishing. The economy it's still a very state-run Ba'athist system, but the economy was slightly improving. Relations with the West were improving. I mean, the United Kingdom had opened a path towards Syria. You had the United States was working with Syria on a number of different regional matters. I mean, most of all, Syria is a beautiful country. You go to areas such as Palmyra. You've got essentially an ancient city, this oasis in the middle of the desert. It's an amazing sight. You've got the Roman amphitheaters in Busra, in Daraa, and in Rasafa, the old cities of Damascus and Aleppo. This is for anyone who loves history or archaeology or even just architecture. Syria was the place to go before.
Was the place, and that's the thing, isn't it? And can I just summarise my view of kind of what happened in Syria, and you can tell me whether it's accurate or not. So we know all about the Arab Spring. We know all about the uprising, and it appeared to me that what happened in Syria was there were a whole load of people who were very unhappy with the way the country was being run by Bashar al-Assad. They felt that he was a dictator, and they got caught up in the Arab Spring and decided to kind of protest. And rather than him tolerating their protest, he absolutely responded with force that was deemed by many people to be way over the top, and he fought back, and before you know it, this war was started, and his response then was immensely tough. In terms of bombing, I remember speaking to a journalist at the time when the barrel bombs first started being dropped, and just absolutely trying to crush any kind of resistance whatsoever. And his attitude has kind of continued the same ever since. Would that be a fair assessment?
I mean, to an extent, what you're saying, part of it is has a large relation to facts which occurred on the ground, and part of it is stuff which you see on the face of it. I mean, I can only give you or confirm to you what I've seen with my own eyes. And in 2011, I was actually in Harasta. It's an area in East Damascus, in Eastern Ghouta, and me and the family have a house there. So I was at that location in spring 2011 on what was a really short trip, and I actually managed to see protests firsthand. I managed to see you could argue that the embers of the war starting in that particular area, and that was just a magnification of all of the other areas in Syria. Basically, you had the Arab Spring which occurred, and instantly it became a trigger for Syria. Without the Arab Spring, Syria stays as it is. There's no way there's going to be change, or there's going to be protest or weaponization of a conflict without what happened in Tunisia, in Egypt, and especially in Libya. Now, the Syria situation occurred. There was peaceful protesters in different areas, and it started off as being a tightly knit kind of situation where you had most of the people protesting at the very start of the conflict were actually political detainees, or people who had differences with the government, people you could probably argue of a Middle Eastern of a middle class structure, lawyers, doctors, etc. And that's how it initially started for the first couple of weeks. Now, the more widespread it got, the more it got to different areas. You had the situation in Daraa. Now, the situation in Daraa, where you had these protests, where you had this response from the security forces initially, that then became a spark for nationwide protests. Now, the situation in Daraa, and this is where you get the emergence of what is the huge polarization in the Syria conflict, of seeing two different sides, two different narratives, where the protesters and the anti-government media claimed that the Syrian security forces were killing them en masse, and a lot of video evidence shows that security forces are either firing on protesters or there are detaining protesters, all sorts of manner of gruesome footage. But on the other side, there's this state view that a lot of these security forces had been killed or died, and that's even supported by the fact that they posted videos and images of these security officers being killed. And what you'd have to say is that both sides, both sets of the truth, have some substance.
People who just say that Assad is a monster, and let's face it, I mean, Donald Trump has called him a monster.
An animal.
How is he viewed by Syrians? How do they think of their leader? Do they think he's a monster?
No, you'd have to say that Syrians living within government territory have a favorable view of the Syrian president. It's only Syrians who have either left the country or who are living abroad who openly state their disapproval and their condemnation for the Syrian president.
But is that because those who live in the government areas are afraid of him?
And that's where I'm going to get to now. You'd have to say that half of the people who live within government-held areas are your average, civilians only concerned with their day-to-day lives. They're not really politically affiliated, and they'd only show this support for the Syrian president in times where a show of loyalty, essentially. And part of that is because of being afraid, but part of that is also because this war has gone on for so long, it's taken so much that the government's actually been able to provide services to people and basically been able to show them, people living under rebel control, look what's happening. But you're living under Syrian government control where there's still services, there's still some sort of, of state structure. And because of that reason, people have gotten to kind of understand and accept this reality, especially within Damascus and Aleppo and other locations. And that's aside from, the hardline government support, which is, let me tell you, it's not strictly from the Syrian coast. That's one of the biggest misconceptions. Without, if we're going to look at this from a sectarian perspective, you've got the typical old school, if you like, bourgeoisie in Damascus, in Aleppo, the typical merchant business class. They've stayed loyal to Assad from almost the very start of the conflict. Without that support from what is a merchant class representing arguably 65 to 70% of the population, there's no way Assad could have stayed in power without that crucial support from, although I hate to discuss it in sectarian terms, but the Sunni Muslim merchant class in Aleppo and in Damascus, who have also, let me just tell you, funded pro-government militias, provided money, funds, arms, all sorts of services to the military and the auxiliary forces to continue fighting this conflict.
We, of course, since 2013 in this country have watched from afar. And back in 2013, you will recall, there was the prospect of us, along with the Americans, getting involved in the war. And we all know what happened next. The British MPs voted against us getting involved, and we didn't. How do the Syrians, those that live in Syria and those that have left to go elsewhere to try and seek some kind of refuge, how do they view Britain getting involved?
Well, definitely the Syrians within government-held Syria would have viewed that decision to not intervene as one of wisdom. The Syrians who have differences with the government and the regime and who have left Syria would view that with contempt, essentially, because for the Syrians opposing Assad, that decision was essentially the final coffin, or the final nail in the coffin of what was called the Syrian Revolution. That's for the Syrians opposing Assad. They believe that Britain's decision not to vote in favor of strikes indirectly led to this huge chain of events which happened afterwards.
And is there anger? Is there anger towards us as a nation for not getting involved from those people?
Yes, of course there's anger, and that anger is still present. You only have to go and speak to any one of Assad's opponents who lives outside of Syria, and they'll tell you that decision could have changed everything, because it wouldn't have handed Assad a very clear military victory as we see today. Now, on the other hand, you'd speak to Syrians in government-held Syria, and they would be of the perspective that if the UK was to have targeted Syria with the US and then launched, thousands of cruise missiles and strikes against Syria, what would be the state of affairs now? You would have what is essentially a relatively Islamic, militant-looking government in Syria now. And that's something which I don't think anyone in the Western world would really want at the moment. I mean, at the end of the day, regardless of accusations of war crimes, of the terrible, gruesome acts which have happened in Syria, Assad's secular at the end of the day. And you don't have to deal with that issue of having the extremist religious element. But
yes,
if he'd have to have handed victory to the Syrian opposition, who would have then fought between each other after taking control of Damascus and other areas, then you'd have a situation now which is similar to what happened in Idlib, what's currently happening in Idlib, where you have this huge life or death struggle between different rebel groups and Al-Qaeda.
Danny,
and you could argue. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm getting some questions, and I know we've only got 5 minutes left. I want to put those questions to you from my listeners. Brian says, did the latest chemical attack really take place, or was it fake? It looked made up to me, says Brian.
Well, I can only give you information from what I've seen on the ground, and that was on the outskirts of Douma on the day after the chemical weapons suspected attack. Now, you could definitely tell that something went down. I can't individually verify it, but you could tell that something went down. Whether it was some sort of chemical attack, whether it was a conventional attack, which maybe would have taken the oxygen away from the area and been more effective than what could have been a chemical attack, remains to be seen. But you can tell that something went down. But what I'd like to raise your awareness is that people have discussed this chemical attack, but more civilians and more people have been killed over the previous 3 days in conventional weapons than have been killed in many other areas in Syria over the previous year. You've had an operation which has killed a lot of civilians through conventional weapons. So the focus just on the chemical attack is from a humanitarian death toll perspective relatively misplaced if you look at the previous weeks in the Eastern Ghouta.
David texts to say, I have a Syrian neighbour who tells me the Western media exaggerate what's going on. When they visited their parents in Damascus last year, they didn't see or hear any warfare. Is that true?
Well, I'd have to disagree with him, to be honest, because I've been based between Damascus and London for a number of times. I mean, you can go to Damascus for a couple of days and not hear sounds of war, but for that period over the previous year, the eastern side of the capital has been absolutely raging on a day-to-day basis. So to suggest that events are fine is very misleading. You've also had Eastern Ghouta rebels shelling Damascus with mortar attacks, so I doubt they would have traveled to Damascus without hearing anything at all, because unless it was for a couple of days maybe. The more you stay in Syria, the more you see the surreal nature of the conflict over the previous couple of years within Damascus.
And I think, to be honest, anybody who doubts what's gone on in Syria, I mean, if you go onto Google and just Google this Syria before and after pictures and have a look at the destruction of some parts of the country. I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking. Some beautiful parts of the country have been destroyed. Yeah. One final question to you, and then I will let you go. And I'm very grateful to you for your time and for giving us a little bit of enlightenment on this. And this is a difficult question, I know. But what do you think is going to happen? How is this war going to come to an end? Will it come to an end? And who's going to win it? And what's the future for Syria?
Well, I mean, that's the start of a question which could lead to an entire book, but I'll try and give you as concise of an answer as possible. The situation in Syria now is heading towards a military victory for Assad in the areas where you have rebel control. Now, you've got Idlib, which is a huge province which is completely under the control of the rebels, but they're currently infighting. So Idlib is going to be the last area to be taken back or to see a battle between Syrian government forces and the rebels. In terms of other areas, they're going to be retaken either through reconciliations, forced evacuations, or military operations. Now, you've got the SDF, which is a majority Kurdish group in the north areas of Syria. You've got the Turks and the rebels, Operation Olive Branch and Operation Euphrates Shield in the north of Syria. And you've got a US presence in the east of the country. In addition to that, you've also got the presence of Iran. Now, that's going to be a precursor for Israel targeting different areas in Syria consistently until the Iranians leave.
So is the long and short of it then, Assad is going to win, and it will be down to him then to rebuild his country. Will he be able to do that?
He won't be able to do that as long as there's foreign forces within Syria. So for the immediate future, it's an Assad victory, absolutely no doubt. No one can doubt that. But it's an Assad victory with lots of complexities. The first of those being the presence of Turkish, US, Kurdish forces in different parts of the country, and the regional escalation, which is set to continue from time to time. I'd just like to tell you this, that over the next couple of months, you're going to be hearing about Syria a lot, because the escalation is going to continue on a regional and an international level. It's not going to stop, but the magnified miniature wars and battles in Syria, that's going to slowly finish and slowly get back into order. But the global perspective, the regional perspective, is going to guarantee a continued escalation of the war in Syria, but it's through different means, through proxy. So the onus, essentially, from the Russian perspective, is on Assad to take back as much territory as possible, because the country is destroyed. You're only taking back rubble. So what's needed at the moment is to actually find agreements with different countries, with different spheres of influence in different segments and sectors of Syria.
So we're not going to end up with a situation where he's going to win the war and then gradually he will start getting the builders in to come and repair the rubble, reduced buildings, and people who've moved to the likes of the UK and to Europe to flee Syria, that they will then start looking to go back home. You don't think that's the natural course of events?
I think that might be the very long-term course of events, but in the immediate future, for the next couple of years, I mean, that policy would be inconceivable to actually apply, because you have this different presence of force. I mean, you've got Turkish forces in the north of Syria going as deep as 3 different provinces. You know, how are you going to get rid of that particular presence and rebuild? It's impossible. You've got the Americans fighting. You've got ISIS in the desert, who's slowly re-emerging at the moment. So you've got so many different dynamics that it's not a clear case of, okay, we've won the war, let's rebuild. The rebuilding is going to take a long time, because it's going to rely on the state of affairs within the country. But the main cities, Damascus, Homs, Aleppo, they're going to be free for people to come back because they're under the government's control. But the war, I can sum this up for you quickly. This war is a war of peripheries now. It's a war of borders. Every location where there is a problem is actually on a border with a foreign country. The war in the center hold of Syria, the central country, is finished. It's all gone out to the outskirts now.
There's some really good talking, Danny. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Very, very interesting. Danny Makki, who's a Syrian journalist